the worlds of art and technology are now coming together. And that's not necessarily a comfortable relationship. But the reason I think that's a really good thing is it means that art is no longer necessarily separate from the tech industry.
Yeah.
Art, digital art, generative art, creative coders can actually shape the future of the tech systems in which we live.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today, I'm very excited to have Alex Estorick, who is the chief editor for Right Click Save, who is the blockchain art publication. We also had Jason Bailey, known as Artnom previously, where we chatted a bit about Right Click Save. And Alex is also a member of Club NFT, part of the team, and he has been a lecturer for Sotheby's Institute and also supports with the reGEN initiative, which we'll be talking about in just a bit. So Alex, so great to have you here. How are you doing?
Thanks for having me, Callo. Doing very well. Another day in Web3, and we're still alive, so that's the main thing.
Right. And Alex, you're based in London, am I right?
Correct. Yes, East London.
East London.
It's quite a big contingent of Web3 folk here, but of course, as you know, we focus on being as global as possible at the magazine. So, whilst I'm happy to celebrate, London as a center for kind of Web3 developments, I don't like the idea that Web3 becomes a kind of a place of metropolitan hubs.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, Alex. I also see it with my audience actually. So I live in Europe, but I try to write a lot about artists and collectors and things happening not only near me, but outside, right? From in America, Latin America, and Asia. It's a challenge, but it's also what makes this a space very special, right? That you can talk about whatever is happening in the world. It's quite exciting, and there is a lot of things happening. So it's quite interesting to have that kind of reach, right?
Well, I appreciate that, and I think your positionality is very important. I think it sometimes feels to me like there's a kind of contest between sort of old forms of centralization and I think a more horizontal, more decentralized space. Decentralized in a good sense, not just sort of entropy. And I think it's very important the work you do. And it's kind of interesting seeing the different editorial platforms that have emerged, sort of different approaches. And I think that makes for a more fertile ecosystem. So yeah, really appreciate the work you do, and kind of I feel like this conversation is overdue. So looking forward.
Yeah, no, we have been, just for everyone listening, we have been chatting a lot via email, right, Alex? And I've been for a long time. I always wanted to write a piece for Right Click Save, and also had Alex in the podcast. So it's great to have you on the show and have this chat. And maybe we can start, Alex, with the early days. So how did you started how did you start in the art world? How was that path? Were you very young when you got interested in art, or in your teenage years? How was it?
So I actually did an art foundation when I left school, but I went to study art history at university, and I had a pretty meandering 20s, to be honest. And I trained as a bespoke tailor for 2 years. I trained as a lawyer. So I have a lot of respect for traditional craft, and I think one of the interesting things about Web3 or digital developments recently is is a respect for the skill and the craft involved in creative coding, in digital production, rather than a sort of perhaps a more traditional repertoire of sort of fine art. So I was a kind of craftsman myself for a little while, then a lawyer, and then I taught art history for many years. And I took a break from teaching, and I went and edited it in Milan for a magazine called Flash Art, which I have a long-standing relationship with. And I started a column there called The Uncanny Valley, which was really trying to, I guess, fill a space between what you might consider to be the kind of critical approach that a lot of contemporary artists adopt, and new developments in sort of AI, AR, and ultimately crypto and NFTs. And so, in a sense, the Uncanny Valley at Flash Art was a kind of, I guess, a test case for Right Click Save. And it was when I was working at Flash Art that I met Jason and I met Casey Reese, and I commissioned them to do a sort of a roundtable conversation about the ecological cost of crypto. And that was just after Memo Action had written his great sort of study of sort of the problems involved in the environmental cost of crypto and so on. So that's how I met Jason. That's how I met Casey, and from then on, I suppose my interest has always been looking at new developments in Web3, blockchain, NFTs, smart contracts with a critical lens. And I think there's a balance, I guess, we try and preserve, which is criticality without cynicism, I guess you could say. And I think we're not evangelical about Web3 technologies, but we also feel that the NFT has brought has created a space for a more inclusive model. And of course, it's hard to preserve that model in a down market, but hopefully that gives you some sort of flavor of where I come from, and perhaps why Jason and I have developed this sort of long-standing position that we should be celebrating a more inclusive vision of digital art, because ultimately that's what the NFT unlocked. You know, it was the potential, not necessarily the reality, but the potential for a vastly expanded community of, or sets of communities of digital creators, and that's something that we try and preserve, and not always successfully. But I think, yes, from my perspective, it's probably worth sort of saying at the outset that I see that there are tendencies towards inclusivity, but particularly in a down market, there are lots of tendencies towards exclusivity as well. And I see that community can be a tool for inclusion, but it can actually also be a tool for building walls and actually excluding. And of course, a market, and I think it's fair to say that the Web3 space has sort of established names now. But I think if we ignore the potential for a more horizontal and more affordable art world where emerging talent can kind of build careers, then in a sense we're losing track of the good things about, you know, Web3.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So you had kind of first a column on Flash Art to discuss the kind of a test, right? To discuss what's happening in blockchain art, digital art, and that led up to Right Click Save, which is one of the most popular publications. And you know, I had the discussion with Jason, and for anybody that's listening, it's I believe podcast number 10, and exciting discussion. You could really see the passion from Jason, and he was very vocal about, you know, be kind of a contrarian, right? So for him, it's very important to, you know, look for new things, look for things that not necessarily people are talking about. And I feel like that's one of the aspects or one of the main drivers of Right Click Save, right? So can you tell us a bit, and for those that haven't read Right Click Save, what's the vision of the publication? You as an editor, what do you look for in terms of content, in terms of topics, artists, and also writers, right, that you invite to collaborate? So what are you looking for exactly in Right Click Save?
So I would say, the longer the magazine has gone on, the more clear about what it's for I have become. And these days, I regard the magazine as a listening exercise, which is to say, in a sense, a space for principally artists, but also collectors, curators, and the whole community of what I regard as kind of hybrid creative entrepreneurs who inhabit Web3. Some of them are more creative, some of them are more curatorial, some of them are sort of purely in it for the collecting. But I think for all of those participants in I think what is quite a coherent community or set of communities, we wanted to be the space where sort of people's voices could be heard and shared. And I think initially my feeling was there was a kind of community who had just not been celebrated by the mainstream contemporary art world. So I felt like originally when we started out, there were a set of conversations, a set of narratives that simply hadn't been explored. So, for example, the article that I always think about is we published a text by a scholar called Luc Espagnol early on called NFTs and the Risk of Perpetual Colonialism, which in some ways, is not the sort of, it wasn't actually the kind of conversation that I think anyone had had meaningfully before that point. And the point of that article was really to address the potential problems of new technologies. And I suppose one of the lessons of Web 2, I think, was that, in a sense, new technologies are sort of emerge, and they solve problems we didn't know we had. And as a result, they kind of also create new problems. And what was interesting to me about being quite early in Web 3 was wondering whether we could sort of get ahead of the problems before they emerged. And so I suppose, the reason we take a sort of critical approach is not only because, we think that, skepticism is the only kind of meaningful road to, truth or a kind of progressive vision of the future. I think it's also because we saw the problems with Web 2 of centralization, of kind of monopoly capitalism. And although I had a lot of interest in the potential positive use cases of smart contracts to automate compensation of labor to artists, to curators, etc., I think that's really exciting. But of course, a smart contract also, automates the present into the future, which could be a very negative thing. And so for me, what was interesting, and it's the same when I teach about these things at various places, it's one thing seeing the positive use cases of NFTs, blockchain, smart contracts, but it's also, I think, important to acknowledge that there are potential pitfalls with each of these new technologies. And technology is not a kind of neutral zone. And so Right Click Save, I guess, was, on the one hand, it was about celebrating a community and listening. And on the other hand, it was about kind of coming to terms with a set of new technologies and maybe ways in which they could be turned towards progressive and inclusive purposes rather than extractive, exploitative, and exclusionary uses. So that's, I guess, what Right Click Save emerged to do. I also have one personal viewpoint. We started out doing criticism because, of course, I respect good writing on art. But what we learned quite quickly was that the genre of art criticism is sort of inherently elitist. And so what we did was we switched our criticism section to our community section, so that, in a sense, Right Click Save is not really a place where a community of intelligent people, probably from the global north, probably very well educated, can impose their values on artists, maybe from the global south, who for example, principally because I think, crypto art is a celebration of artists from all around the world. What we wanted to do was kind of create a collision zone for different approaches, different viewpoints. And we have kind of, sort of quite lefty socialist voices. We have some pretty right-wing techno-libertarian voices. And we see that, you can have a kind of meaningful debate within a climate of toleration. And that is something that obviously we feel is very important to have. But I think that there's a specific point and something I wanted to do specifically, which was, I believe that the language that artists use should be the language used to evaluate their art. I don't necessarily feel that a class of mediators and gallerists and curators, yes, etc., and people like me, by the way, should necessarily be imposing the language on the artist. So that's sort of some of maybe that's a flavor for what we've tried to do. But honestly, I'm not a sort of mouthpiece. I'm trying to sort of listen to every voice I hear, and there are certain words that seem important to me. And I listen and I hear them every day, and I see them on Twitter every day. And then there are other words that feel artificial, that I don't think are necessarily natively Web3, and they're not language or words being used by the artists themselves. So I tend to have a kind of artist first grassroots approach to what we do, if that makes sense.
No, that's that's a fantastic way to describe it. And it's when you think about it, to kind of lay down this vision that you have, it's very complex, right? Because you need to have many voices, you need to have kind of a good eye to understand what's happening, you have to pay attention to the whole space. You cannot only look towards a particular marketplace or platform or a particular style. You have to be kind of always open and watching. And then well, I guess one of my question was, that I have prepared, your role as an editor, because I'm very curious. I have my newsletter where I share my thoughts, I share art that I like, I share market analysis, but I'm doing this alone, right? I haven't worked with an editor before. I've never been I never edited, let's say, articles for a publication or a magazine, but it's something that I'm very interested in. And I wonder, how is that process, Alex? How is the process of working with other writers? How is the process of giving feedback? How is the process of, discussing? Is it like, how do you define it, like, yourself? Are you somebody that it's highly critical on pieces, or you let, the writers kind of take control? How is that? How would you describe that process?
So I would say that a good editor is dealing with two things principally. That's form, the language itself, and the meaning as well. And so there are times when one might come across a text and you might think, oh, that word might be replaced with this word, or those two words might be replaced with this one word, to simplify and clarify. But there might also be a time when a sentence, and I would say the tradition of contemporary art criticism is often a little bit florid. It's a bit floral. It tends to be kind of sometimes descriptive without being necessarily meaningful. And so at its most sort of proactive, obviously editing is, I think, a way of sort of establishing meaning, not necessarily imposing my meaning, but perhaps finding what the original intention of the author was, and kind of bringing that to the surface together. That's what a good editor would do. I tend to think I'm a very bad editor. I'm quite a good rewriter. And so, I have to say, this is probably the good forum to apologize to all of our writers who are invariably very tolerant with me, but hopefully feel that at the end, the outcome is a sort of kind of magnification of their voice. And of course, it's very important not to alter the language too much of one's writers, because it's a privilege to be able to collaborate with people like Charlotte Kent or Brian Fry, or any number of writers in this space. I would also say, one of the interesting things about Right Click Save, from my perspective at least, is when we started, I don't know if there was a very developed native language of Web3. And I think perhaps something that I've been resistant to is sort of bringing contemporary art terminology into Web3 on the basis that it understands Web3 better than, for example, the artists themselves. And I think, for example, we've obviously done a lot of work on generative art. And one of the interesting things about generative art, or the history of computer art, algorithmic practices, and generative art, what we now call, I think, generally speaking, generative art, is over the 60 years or whatever, 70 years or so that it's been practiced, different words have been used about it. And I think one of the interesting things for me is we have a section called Crypto Histories, where you have, I think, competing languages. And one of the articles I'm in some ways most excited about still is a text we did. It was really an interview, a community interview with Roman Voroshko, who's now a very old man. We got a load of generative artists to ask questions to Roman. And that was interesting because you had two generations or multiple generations of artists using language that was familiar to some, but maybe not to all. And so for me, I think Right Click Save is not an attempt to impose one particular language, but it is about, I think, listening to communities and acknowledging, and this is something Casey Reese said in a recent conversation we had, that it does seem that generative art has become the kind of mutually, generally agreed, generally accepted term about a particular kind of sort of code-based production. And so it's very important to acknowledge that when the community uses one phrase, we go with that phrase. It's not to say that there are, they were wrong in the 60s to talk about computer art. But it's really, for me, it's very interesting how obviously language evolves over time. And it's also something I take very seriously. So, for example, when I said to Roman, was the work that you were doing in the 1970s generative art? He said, oh, yes, absolutely, it was generative art. Even if generative art was not a phrase used in the 1970s to talk about it. So that's been a really interesting exercise. And I guess the point I'm just trying to get across is Right Click Save is not supposed to be nebulous. It's not supposed to be like all the language used, everything is equal. I guess it's been about trying to understand the language that has emerged now and the histories behind those languages.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, and actually something that I kind of debate myself when I'm writing. There are some terms, right? There are some phrases created by the community, Web3 or maybe NFT community or also blockchain art community, and I'm wondering, like, it's okay to use these terms because some of them are really informal, right? Or somebody, if my friends that are not into this movement read this, they will be like, what are you talking about? Like, what are these phrases, these terms? So it's very interesting that you actually kind of have this in your mind, and it's kind of an important aspect, right, of Right Click Save, how to use those terminologies and actually embrace them, right? I think that's a very good way to put it.
If I can just say, I think I think it's very important that when you're dealing with an emerging, or dare I say even an emergent discourse, for me, it's very important not to impose too many rules, because of course, the language that may end up being used to describe what's happening now, which might be generative art, it might be long form generative art, but it might be something different, is not, we shouldn't be so arrogant to assume that we can already see or know the categories of quote unquote art or creative production that have emerged. When I'm teaching, there's usually a few categories that I kind of explore and sort of tease. But I'm also always sort of conscious about saying, well, these are sort of, in a sense, terms in flux. And even, I'm sure, you've experienced the same thing. I never know whether blockchain art is now something else, something bigger, or whether blockchain art is a subcategory. And also you have disagreement. You have some people who regard parametric art as separate from generative art. They regard randomness as essential to generative art. And there are other people who regard parametric art as a branch of generative art, artists included. There are artists who regard AI art as a branch of generative art. There are artists who would never use the phrase AI art. They might use the phrase ML art, machine learning art. And I'm always fascinated by this kind of contested language sort of terrain. But I guess it's important just to stress that, again, I don't feel that we are living in a kind of world of total relativity. I don't feel that, there is no solid ground whatsoever. There are some words that people use more often than other words, but even those words are also contested. So I think it's important to say that. I don't think it's completely nebulous, and I don't think that everyone is right. I think that, all we can do, and all I do at the magazine, is listen and try and establish, I guess, popularity of language, and also try to explain why some language becomes less popular, for example.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, especially because not sure if it's something specific to our space, but people are, some people hate some terms and they are actually angry that you use some terms. So it's kind of tricky. And I agree that our job is not really to define at this moment, it's more to listen and just understand the differences if we can at the moment. And my question, I'm wondering, do you think in the future, and maybe we can look back in history, this will be kind of defined, there will be specific terms for X or Y, and they will teach this in universities and schools in a more structured way? Or how does it happen? Or what's the story behind art, let's say from 300, 400 years ago? At some point, some historians actually put like the fundamentals, right? And people agree. And I guess we could see that happening in 20, 50 years from now, but it's hard to do. So I guess the question is, do you think at some point there will be clear definitions into this movement and what everything means, and that's how people will, talk about this? Or do you think that will never happen?
No, that always happens. But I would say, I perhaps like Jason, I tend on the side of the contrarian. I do think that the NFT is a challenge to the traditional, not only the traditional art world or the mainstream contemporary art world, but actually to traditional histories of art. I would also say that there is an increasing tendency, I don't know if you feel this, towards books about the end of art And there have been books written recently. There's a book called After Art. There's a book called Likeness and Presence, A History of the Image Before the Era of Art. I think there's a book called Is Contemporary Art Over, or something like that. I suppose one of the things I find interesting is not so much passing judgment on whether art is over or not. I would say that it seems to me one of the things that has followed the NFT is a growing acceptance of a set of digital practices as art, rather than as digital illustration, digital design, graphic design, game engine design, and so on. I'm not saying they are not examples of digital illustration. I wouldn't hopefully be that arrogant. But the fact that people are using the word art to describe things that were historically not art, I find fascinating. So I think, there's a gallery platform called Expanded Art. We published a text last year by Jesse Damiani called Curating in Post-Reality, which discussed the idea of art in expanding fields. I think from my perspective, it is very interesting and I think it's very appropriate to see an expansion of the field of art. And I find that very interesting. I think, I wrote this text recently called Art After NFTs. And in that, article, I guess I made the point that, if you take a CryptoPunk is a highly valuable work of digital art. It's certainly crypto art. It's also unquestionably a collectible. It is definitely generative art. In essence, it challenges all of our pre-existing categories of fine art.
Yeah.
And I think, and by the way, that is not unique to this moment, but I do find it particularly fascinating, just the sheer the level of expansion. The moment you involve digital practices in art, you really widen the range of who can participate in that market or set of markets. So I find that to be a very positive thing in a certain way. I also, I wrote a really weird text recently, or not weird to me, but I think an unusual text, which was called The Byzantine History of NFTs. And the point I was just trying to make was that token economies have existed since time immemorial. They existed in ancient China. They existed on the border of the Byzantine Empire in the 7th century AD, and that's pre-capitalism. So I think it's fair to say that one of the things the NFT did was it rendered transparent the relationship between art and money. And I think that is from my perspective, that's a very good thing, because I think fine art, contemporary art, historically has tried to obscure the relationship between art and money. And I think money is very important. It's very important that artists can get paid a living wage. But of course, we are clearly living in a new stage of capitalism. Web3, I think, does represent a new stage of tech capitalism. On the other hand, tokenomics and not only NFTs, but also, ordinals and other kinds of token have precedent pre-capitalism. So there are developments we're seeing right now which have precedent in the period before capitalism, before art in its modern sense. So for me, that's very interesting.
And do you have some examples of that, Alex? Like what examples? Because I found that very interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, probably the best example, the easiest example I can use is the Byzantine token, the pilgrim token, and that was the basis for my project with Ana Maria Caballero, Artifacts. And for example, if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in New York, you will find a collection of what are called stylite tokens. And these are tokens made in lead or ceramic that have the imprint of Saint Simeon Stylites, who was a famous ascetic saint. And what people would do, they would burn incense on these tokens, and they would achieve spiritual grace, spiritual healing, but also medicinal healing from these tokens. So this was an Orthodox Christian token economy. And, this sort of AI generated project that I did with Anna recently, in a sense, was trying to show that actually what we're seeing now is not necessarily art in its traditional sense. It has a kind of historical quality that brings us back to Byzantine tokens, to Hawala networks. We published a text early on Right Click Save called The Hawala History of the NFT. Hawala networks have been a kind of really interesting alternative economy for many centuries. And I think basically, Callo, I think what I like about art after NFTs is it allows us to talk and think about alternative economies. And we published a text by Judy Mam on 01, and which is an interesting platform because it, in a sense, what it does is it shows you the value of art beyond financial value. And I think that is something that has been true of art for many centuries, before the emergence of the market for art in the 17th century, which I think you were referring to. So that's really interesting to me. But of course, one has to be very responsible when one is drawing these very big historical relationships. And there's a historian who I recommend anyone listening looks into, called Reinhard Koselleck, and he developed a theory of historical times, which is basically premised on the idea that you can look at NFTs alongside medieval tokens, and you can see and find meaningful relationships between them. It's not an inappropriate thing to do, but when you do it, you have to be responsible in the conclusions that you're drawing. So for me, that's really interesting, but it does represent, I think, a challenge to traditional approaches, not only to art, but also to academia, scholarship about art. And that's a big challenge to, centralized networks which have existed for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of exciting information. I would like to touch on two things. So first, you mentioned the project with Ana Maria Caballero, who is an artist that I'm a big fan of, and she's also one of the earliest readers of the newsletter. And I know the project you mentioned, it was released on Mprops, right? This AI platform. So that takes me to the AI topic, Alex, and I would like to hear your opinion. I mean, both as an editor and writer. So how is AI affecting your practice? And what do you think of the readers, the Right Click Save readers see, or what are their reactions to AI art in general? So I've seen some people that love it. Some people are really, really against them, against any kind of AI tool. What are your thoughts there? I mean, in your job, to make your job easier, but also in the terms of art and AI art as a whole. What's the reaction you see in general from your readers?
So I obviously talk to my readers, as you do, and my sense is that readers appreciate that we don't use ChatGPT. And I have a deputy editor with whom I proofread and I copy edit, and we are, I guess, for the moment, preserving Right Click Save as a space of human labor. However, we also celebrate what I would argue is a very important project, which is, I guess you could call it post-humanism, which is this idea that I think it's important for us to come to terms with a vision of the human which is not anthropocentric. So we place the natural world on the same level as the human, or even above, together on the same level as the non-human, the machine. And so I think, first of all, I would say, and this comes into, and this sort of intertwines a lot of articles that we publish, is this idea of kind of what it means to come to terms with a post-human condition. And I think it's important to make a distinction between post-humanism and transhumanism. Transhumanism tends to regard, in a sense, machines as, in a sense, a way of creating a superhuman, in a sense.
Yeah, like connecting them like a hybrid, right, and making it one entity, but smarter and stronger and having all kind of
Yes.
skills.
And I suspect that is, in a sense, inevitable. But I from my perspective, I think the progressive politics, when it comes to the AI debate, revolves around, I think, a kind of equality or equilibrium between human, non-human, and natural, or more than human. And you have artists like Entangled Others who deal with that. And a number of other artists as well. Amelia Winger Bearskin comes to mind, but there are lots of others who are interested, I suppose you could say, in the kind of the politics of the post-human condition. Obviously, also, one of the founding members of Club NFT is Danielle King, who's become a very important figure in the movement for AI art or ML art, or generative AI. Obviously, MProps, I think, is a wonderful platform, and I think long form generative AI projects, which is, I think, the language that they would still use, offers a lot of interesting potential. Obviously, I would say that because I personally think that the Artifacts project that Anna and I did. Without that platform, we wouldn't have been able to push those ideas out into the world. So I guess I'm biased in a sense, but I also, was, have had long conversations with Danielle about, the importance of being open to sort of machine learning. And of course, there are also, there's a long history of artists working with machine learning. People like, Anna Ridler or Mario Klingerman and so on, and many more. We could go back to Harold Cohen in the 1970s if we wanted to. I think you can probably tell that my interest tends to be about listening to the artists. If they find it valuable, if collectors find it valuable, then clearly it's relevant to Right Click Save. But in the same way, it's obviously also important to establish historical genealogies for this practice, and hopefully in a progressive way. I think that's important to stress, because ultimately we try to be critical and we try to be plural in the politics of Right Click Save, but in a sense we are trying to drive a more inclusive, more progressive understanding of the post-human condition.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, way to put it. And Alex, just for context, what are some numbers from Right Click Save, like number of articles, number of writers, how many artists have you showcased? I don't know if you keep track of these things, but it will be interesting to know.
Yeah, I'm going to pull up some figures for you. So we've had, I think we've had, we've just published our 251st article, which was, having published the 250th on Friday, which was this great conversation with FX Hash. We've had 137 writers. We've had around just under 140,000 readings. So new readers we've had, nearly 140,000. I would say that our committed readership is certainly lower than that. And it'll be interesting to see, I think it's worth pointing out that Right Click Save opened in January 2022, but the down market began, the bear market began basically in March 2022. So one of the benefits of that was that I think a lot of the kind of empty hype that was driving the market in 2021 disappeared. So we've actually, in a sense, from the magazine's perspective, maybe not from the artist's perspective, we've benefited from, I think, the hype draining away. And actually, what's interesting about that is, in the absence of hype, in a sense, the only thing you have left is real cultural value. And from our perspective, the way of measuring real cultural value is, listening to voices. What are the things that are preoccupying artists? What are the ethics in the market? Obviously, the Ethereum merge was a big thing to have happened since the last bull market. So that's great. We know that the next bull market, as and when it arrives, whether it's arrived, today or last week or not yet, I think it's fair to say we will be dealing with a different ecosystem. And I'd like to think that it will be, Right Click Save, just like Blind Gallery, just like Outland, just like All Ships, just like Super Rare Magazine. All of these publications and cultural contributors have laid foundations, I think, for a different art world to emerge, certainly a different crypto art world, whenever the bull market reappears. So stats wise, I'm very proud of the work we've done. We've been a small team, like you, we're a small team. Like a lot of Web3 platforms, we are a lean startup, and that's good in one sense, which means that there's always a human scale to that occupation. Of course, the problem is it's very difficult to scale. You always have to work hard to survive, particularly in the down market, and everybody's under a lot of pressure. But I'm very grateful to the friends and also very admiring of your work, of all of the people that I see every day who work damn hard to celebrate what's going on at a time when the market is not necessarily doing the same. And I think that's really great. And obviously, it's one thing, participating in a market when everything's exciting and rosy and hypey. It's quite another to be, doubling down in dark times. So, fingers crossed for the future, but I don't regret, this period at all.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think from what you are doing and what other outlets that you mentioned are doing is great for, as you said, when the bull market comes and new people, right, come into the space. There are now more places, more entities, more websites, magazines, newsletters that are talking about art, and they have some, clear vision on what they are showcasing, and it's much easier for those people to find this small area of the Web3 space. And that probably when you started, when I started, it wasn't that the case, right? There weren't these sort of publications out there. That's why I started my newsletter, right? Because it was so hard for me to find, interesting sources to learn, basically, and then to stay up to date. So great job, Alex, what you're doing. I also told Jason, also with the other initiatives that you have been doing. I think the reGEN particularly is quite exciting. Can you tell us a bit about that? What's the concept behind reGEN, and what have you accomplished so far?
Well, I guess, from my vantage point, I see things that are missing in the space. And, Jason, Nicole, and I, also, we started FemGen back in, I think this time last year. We hosted FemGen in sort of in Wynwood during Miami Basel.
Yeah, I was there actually. Yeah.
And so that was the only reason I draw attention to that, and that was supported by Art Blocks, Eric Calderon. It was supported by the Funny Guys. It was supported by Kylo. That was an organic grassroots kind of product that sought to address an issue that had become a really important, but also a really problematic. I think a really problematic part of Web3, which was the representation of female generative artists or female identifying generative artists. So FemGen, for example, was, I guess, seeing a big issue and trying to address it. reGEN was a collaboration, and it continues with one of the first NFT scholars, Fotini Valianti, who's a scholar at University College London, and she wrote the first academic publication on NFTs and museums. So she is, I think it's important to stress that Right Click Save is as far as possible, it's a kind of scholarly enterprise, but it's also kind of quick and dirty. We obviously publish things more quickly than they can be peer reviewed. So I've been very grateful for scholars like Fotini for collaborating and writing for the publication, because it's hard for academics to publish in a public context which is not peer reviewed, because their reputations are more vulnerable. So for me, I've really respect Fotini's work a lot, and we basically partnered up to develop an NFT auction to coincide with Cure Cubed, which is an ongoing charitable enterprise that raises money for Cure Parkinson's, which is one charity specializing in neurodegenerative diseases. This year we have done, I guess you could say, 3 auctions. We did Cure Cubed, which was with Bonhams in London, which raised sort of $270,000 something, with thanks to FX Hash and thanks to the FX Hash community. Certainly without that community, we would not have raised that sum. And I think that was a really exciting moment for us, because what it told us was that, first of all, there's a really important and I think ethical component to Web3. Whether it is, fundraising crypto and getting crypto into Ukraine, or, I think what we've seen over the last few years is the capacity of cryptocurrency to be a source of charitable revenue. And what has been really interesting, I think, to us is getting to know different charities and being able to offer them this alternative revenue stream, but also this alternative community of collectors that has an ethical code. And I think so for us, we wanted to bring together particularly long form generative art, because of course, the more outputs you have, the greater the chances of raising a really significant sum. One of the lessons that we've learned, which is not necessarily a positive, is that the secondary market, particularly in a bear market, the secondary market, which could stand to really benefit charities, has not been so successful. So what we've learned is that long-form generative art is an amazing way of raising money for charity, whether it's Cure Parkinson's, the ALS Association with snow froze squiggles and vertical crypto art, or most recently the Cure Alzheimer's Fund, which was a collaboration with the Giving Block. The secondary sales of these outputs have not been so great. Thankfully, the primary sales have all been pretty successful. But so, it's not a perfect solution. But I think, from our perspective, there's a lot of people feel very strongly about neurodegenerative diseases because they affect so many people around the world. It's very hard to find anyone who doesn't have a family member or personal relationship with someone who's suffered. So that's been the basis for reGEN, and obviously we want to build this out next year. I think it is probably fair to say that in a bull market, we're still to see the full power of charitable generative art auctions, but I certainly would like to explore that going forward.
Yeah, no, I mean that's first it's a great thing you are doing there. I really congrat you there because it's I know how hard it is to you know build these things, build the art, build the website, build the promotion. So it's a lot of effort, and I think it's a very noble cause. And I think, yeah, as you said, when the bull market kind of comes back, these are fantastic tools for to raise money for charity. And the good thing about the blockchain is that it's transparent. The given block, they have this technology where you can trace where the funds went, and they have an amazing amount, I mean, incredible amount of institutions and different places where you can donate via crypto, different blockchains, different crypto coins. So it's a great way to do it.
I want to
And
just, if I can just say, I have to say, one of the, I think it's fair to say that in a down market, without the artists, it's fair to say in any context, without the artists, these kinds of charitable projects are impossible. But it's fair to say in the bear market, without people like Marcelo Soria Rodriguez and everyone, Nat Sarkissian, Melissa Wiedericht, Sputniko, I'm just going to list the 5 that have participated in our most recent, Robert Hodgin, without the kind of the willingness on the part of these artists to, let's be honest, take less money for their own cultural labor, we would not be able to raise this money. So I think it's very important to say that, because I think Web3 has a bad rap. And I think a lot of people are skeptical about NFTs because of the speculative potential. I would say that the speculative potential of NFTs is one of the principal ways in which they can be used as a charitable vehicle. And I think artists working with long form generative art understand that. And I think, hopefully reGEN has showed a better side of Web3 and a way in which actually, NFTs shouldn't be a kind of an embarrassing technology. It should actually be something we celebrate. But of course, it does depend on the ethics of the communities who use them.
Yeah, I think you said it perfectly. And I really like that idea of kind of using that speculative assets in a good way, right? So it's
Yes.
okay, you can speculate, but we are also going to target that towards something good. So I think that's a great way to put it. And Alex, we have been talking almost for an hour, and I always like to ask the guests this question. So put you on a tough spot and to name 3 artists that inspire you that you would like to mention.
So I've written down 2 artists who I included in my recent article, Art After NFTs, both from Buenos Aires, just trying to be topical because, of course, Bright Moments has just been in Buenos Aires. And I have to say, shout out to Bright Moments. I feel what that project has done increasingly is to celebrate local communities of artists around the world. And I don't know if that was the case at the beginning, but for me, Buenos Aires was a really great example where Bright Moments and the local community were fully integrated. And it seemed to me to be a really nice way in which both generative art and crypto art actually came together. And when I say crypto art, I'm really talking about digital artists of all kinds, all around the world, making a career thanks to the NFT. So the 2 artists from Buenos Aires is Xelda Jara and Pamilo Ceirone. Both of them are in my article. The other artist is Stephanie Dinkins, and I think it's really important, Callow, just before we finish, to stress that it seems to me there are artists like Xelda and Pamilo, who have built careers outside of the mainstream art world. And for me, that is the principal reason Right Click Save exists. So it's absolutely my responsibility to celebrate those artists. Okay. At the same time, I also value artists who can turn technologies to progressive ends. And I feel that one of the powerful things about creative coding is that creative coding, in a sense, is not only a way to produce visually seductive images, it's also a way to produce new digital systems that we are going to be living in the future. And in my experience, when you allow artists to work on and develop the digital systems in which we live, those systems invariably have a greater ethical component, a more inclusive component. And the reason I use Stephanie Dinkins is Stephanie has been working with small data for a decade. And a couple of years ago, leading computer scientist Andrew Ng said, we don't need more big data, we need better small data. And Stephanie's been working with small data for years. And what I learned when I heard that was that actually artists, when they are working with digital technologies, can actually shape the future of our own experience of the world in a positive way. And I think that is one of the most profound things about Web3, is that in Web2, you never had a Web2 artist. You had, fine art, contemporary art, and new media art, or even post-internet art. But basically, art and tech were separate. In Web3, you have Web3 artists. And what that tells me is that the worlds of art and technology are now coming together. And that's not necessarily a comfortable relationship. But the reason I think that's a really good thing is it means that art is no longer necessarily separate from the tech industry.
Yeah.
Art, digital art, generative art, creative coders can actually shape the future of the tech systems in which we live. And the history of Web 2 is, I think, is basically a history of what happens when the wider world has no real way of affecting the systems in which they live.
Right.
What I think, artists like Stephanie, but also honestly, all of the artists in Web3 are capable of is actually changing the world that we live in now.
Yeah, basically they can shape the experience, right? And it's you experiment basically your way through this new web. And it's also like there is more flexibility for platforms, for developers, for any kind of creator, right? To shape the experience, and for the consumer, the collector, the fan to have a more direct connection, right? So you're right. It feels like before technology kind of communities and people didn't have a way to kind of shape the technology. And now, thanks to decentralization, NFTs, and blockchain, creators have a way to shape these things, and artists in particular can create works of art that can be experimented, right? So that's really a very, very good point there, Alex.
I would also say that after the pandemic, it's no longer really sustainable to think that art is separate from life. Our experience of the world is mediated by digital systems. Let's not be in any doubt. We can pretend that it's not, but we would be lying to ourselves. And what I like about Web3 is a lot of the artists embrace the fact that actually it's a brave new world. And they have much, much more power to shape the experience of people, not just, art-going people, but everyone, than they've ever had before. And I think it's really important that the good things about art in its traditional sense, the critical components, the conceptual components, and the ethical components are not lost as art and tech come together. That is very possible. But when I see, the Web3 community, and I see the ethics that I think underpins a lot of the work that people do in this space, I feel positive that art and tech can come together in a way that doesn't sacrifice the ethical code of the community on the altar of capitalism.
That's a great reflection. And Alex, it was a great conversation. I mean,
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Callo.
I hope we can do this in the future, and let's stay in touch. I really want to get, write an article and have it out there and right click save. I'm okay with your feedback. You can be very strict with your with your review on my own. I'm looking forward to that.
I'm sure no changes will be necessary.
Thanks a
Thanks
lot,
for having
Alex.
me.
Have a great day. Bye
And you.
bye.